All right, hello again. Third lecture here. We're still covering some general information about the endocrine system and the hormones it produces and how they, what that all means, and in a general way, how they perform their actions in the body. And so we're going to continue on with that here, and then after this, we'll start talking about particular endocrine glands and the hormones that they make, and so we'll start seeing some more details. And some of this, I know some of this information can seem a little abstract when you're first hearing about it, and it does make more sense as you start talking about individual hormones and can actually see what we mean. What do we mean by a response on target cells? A lot of this starts to make more sense when you start discussing particular endocrine hormones. Okay, so remember in the last video lecture I mentioned that your hormones tend to fall into two chemical classes, and those can include your amino acid derived hormones, and there are many different examples of those. And amino acids are building blocks of peptides and proteins, so peptide hormones and protein hormones fall into that category as well. So most of your amino acid, oops, hang on, I have to turn on my pen. I'll change my pen color here too. All right, most of your amino acid based hormones are water soluble, and that's really another phrase that means hydrophilic, water loving. These are molecules that dissolve in water-based fluids very easily, and so they travel through water-based fluids very easily, diffuse around. So these types of hormones, they tend to act, of course all hormones bind to receptors on their target cells. Water-soluble hormones bind to plasma membrane receptors. That means the receptor molecules, like you see here on this diagram, are sitting in the plasma membrane of the cell, and here comes a hormone, a water-soluble hormone. Remember I mentioned that that's like the key, the receptor is like the ignition, and so those two come together very specifically. So that means that a receptor for growth hormone is going to bind only growth hormone. It's not going to bind insulin. It's not going to bind a thyroid hormone. They're very particular about what they attach to. And then what happens after those two come together, we'll talk a little bit more about this shortly. Now the cell has to make a response. It's going to change its behavior in some way. It's going to alter its metabolism. It's either going to stop producing something it was making before, or it may start producing something it was not making before. It might break something down it was not breaking down before. There's going to be responses that are made. Those have to happen inside the cell. Well, we just said the hormone is binding to the receptor at the cell surface. So, how do you get a response to happen on the inside? Well, as we'll see, those responses occur through the action of what are called second messengers. Second messengers are internal. Chemical molecules, chemical signaling molecules, and they become activated, or they start becoming produced when a hormone binds to a cell surface receptor. Those two things coming together sets off a chain reaction that leads to a second messenger molecule being produced, and then that second messenger molecule sets off additional changes inside the cell that lead to responses. So since the hormone cannot enter the cell, the second messenger is kind of like picking up the signal from the cell surface and carrying it to the inside and causing a response to be made inside the cell. The reason on this particular diagram they have CAMP, that's actually not pronounced camp. That is an abbreviation for a molecule called cyclic or cyclic AMP. AMP is adenosine monophosphate. You guys remember ATP, adenosine triphosphate. AMP is the same molecule, it just has one phosphate on it instead of three, so it's called AMP, or adenosine monophosphate. And then that molecule is changed a little bit so that it makes a cycle type shape. And so that's where the name cyclic AMP comes from. And that's one of the most widely used molecules as a second messenger inside the cells of the body. So I just wanted to point out what that was. All right, here's another diagram from your textbook. And no, I do not expect you guys to memorize the details that you see here on this particular diagram. I do want you guys to understand what a second messenger is in general and how that's carrying the signal from the surface to the inside of the cell, and that it sets off a series of events, or like a chain reaction that leads to a response inside the cell. But what they're showing you here on this diagram, all right, so right here you've got a receptor for a water-soluble type hormone. And remember, water-loving molecules, they don't freely diffuse across the plasma membranes of cells because they hate the fatty acid tails in the cell membrane. Remember that from your Biology 201 course. So that's why they have to dock at the cell surface. They actually can't freely diffuse across the cell membrane because they're water-loving and your cell membrane is mostly hydrophobic. Once those two come together, what they're showing you here is there's another type of protein that's connected to the receptor. It's called a G protein. And when the hormone binds its receptor, that activates this G protein. And they're showing you a GTP molecule here. GTP attaches when it becomes activated. And once that happens, that molecule actually slides along the inside of the membrane and it docks with an enzyme called adenylate cyclase. So that's an enzyme that's sitting in the membranes of many of your cells, and it doesn't do anything unless this G protein that's been activated attaches to it. Once those two come together, your adenylate cyclase is now able to take ATP, good old ATP that you hear about all the time in biology, and that enzyme, remember enzymes do chemical reactions, they build things or they break things down depending on their functions, takes ATP and converts it over to this cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP. And so this is a chemical molecule that is now going to kind of function like the hormone inside the cell. That's your second messenger. Cyclic AMP sets off a set of events that leads to a response. And that's what they're showing you here. You have inactive, in many cases you have inactive enzymes that are called protein kinases, and they become activated. And I don't really care that you learn that nitty-gritty level of detail. I just want you to know that as the second messenger molecules are made inside, that leads to a series of step-by-step events. You know, it's going to differ for different types of hormones, and that series of events triggers responses, whatever they may be. It could be activating other enzymes, it could be causing production of something, breaking down of something, opening ion channels. The cells may secrete something that they didn't secrete before. There are many different examples. There's a lot of variety in terms of what happens in target cells in response to particular hormones. But hopefully the take-home message here is the hormone binds to its receptor at the cell surface. Only when that happens do you get production of this molecule inside the cell, the second messenger. You need the second messenger to set off the series of events that lead to a response. So that's kind of the take-home message here about how these water-loving, water-soluble hormones work. All right, now what about the hormones that don't like watery-based fluids? These are your lipid-soluble hormones. So they love fatty, hydrophobic things rather than water-loving things. Now, unlike the water-loving hormones, your hydrophobic hormones can move across the cell membrane. They don't mind the phospholipids in your cell membranes. They don't mind those fatty acid tails, so they will wiggle their way right across the cell membrane and enter the cell. The receptors for your lipid-soluble hormones are intracellular receptors. That means they're inside the cell. They're not sitting up on the cell membrane. And again, that's because these hormones don't have any trouble diffusing directly into the cell because they're hydrophobic. So what they do is they attach to, so in green here, here's a lipid-soluble hormone, receptors on the inside. They come together and they bind, and then what they do is they cause certain genes on your DNA to be expressed or read when they weren't being expressed or read before. Let's take a look at, here's a diagram from your textbook which is showing that in a little bit more detail. All right, so your steroid, the example they're showing here is a steroid type hormone. So steroid hormones, such as, there are multiple examples of these, but testosterone is a male sex hormone, estrogen is a major female sex hormone. Those are steroid type hormones. So they are able to diffuse inside cells. The receptors for those hormones are inside the cell. They come together inside the cell. That makes a receptor hormone complex when those two come together. That enters the nucleus of the cell where your DNA is located. And then recall that, if you remember from the little bit you learned about genetics and biology 201, genes are locations on DNA that function as blueprints for proteins that a cell is going to make. They're chemical blueprints. And so not every gene in every cell in your body is being read all the time. Genes can be turned on or turned off. Well, when a receptor, when a hormone, a steroid, when a lipid-soluble type hormone and its receptor come together, those complexes attach to DNA close to particular genes, and that causes those genes to be turned on. All right, so that means you start doing transcription. If you remember that from biology 201, that's where you make RNA copies of genes, and then those mRNA or messenger RNA copies of the genes are then read by ribosomes. Remember, those are the little structures inside your cells that make proteins. So in a nutshell, a hormone and a receptor coming together triggers this. It triggers the production of new proteins in that cell that were not being made before. All right, and if you don't recall the basics that you learned about in biology 201 with regard to genetics, you don't have to know a whole lot, but I've got a link here on this slide which is pointing out to, it's a website called 23andMe. That's actually a website you can go to if you want to have some genetic testing done on yourself, and they've got a pretty nice little basic reminder animation there that you can play. And over here I've got some summary information about genes and proteins and the relationship between the two. And keep in mind that the various proteins that cells make are the chemical workhorses of cells. They play many different roles. So if a cell starts making proteins that it was not making before, that is going to alter that cell's activity. It's going to have functions or traits or properties that it did not have before that protein or proteins were being made. All right, so some additional information here about hormones and the cells that they act on. So I've already mentioned multiple times that hormones act on target cells. A cell is not a target unless it has receptors for that particular hormone. So target cell specificity is a major important feature of different hormones because some hormones don't have very many targets. For example, your pituitary gland makes a hormone called ACTH. We'll be learning more about that later. And its only target cells are in your adrenal cortex. That's a portion of your adrenal glands on the left and the right side. So that particular hormone, ACTH, has very specific targets. They're really only in one location in the body. All right, and in contrast, thyroxines, that's another name for thyroid hormones, which we'll be learning about later. Receptors for those hormones are found in nearly every cell in the body. And then a lot of your other hormones fall somewhere in between. So some of them are very restricted about where their target cells are located because there are only a few cell types in the body that make the receptors, that have the receptors for that hormone. Whereas others may act on many, many, many different cell types and locations in the body. So that's target cell specificity. That's going to vary for different hormones. All right, and then as far as target cells becoming activated, three major factors determines whether or not target cells are going to become activated or not. Are they going to make a response? And some of these are just kind of common sense when you think about it. Blood levels of the hormone. Hormones exist in particular concentrations. That's how many molecules of the hormone do you have in a particular volume of fluid. Those concentrations tend to be maintained by negative feedback mechanisms, which means they go up and down. As they go up, the endocrine gland makes less of the hormone so that the hormone levels go back down. When they drop down a little bit too low, the endocrine gland starts making more of the hormone so that the levels go back up. That's negative feedback. That's an important aspect of homeostasis you hear about over and over again in your anatomy and physiology classes. All right, so it makes sense. The target cells are more likely to respond to a hormone if its concentrations are higher. If its concentrations are lower, they're going to be less likely to make responses. Now another one, relative number of receptors on or in the target cell. So if you think about it, you got a cell here, and we got a cell over here, and let's say this cell has a low number of receptors for a hormone on its surface, and let's say this one over here has a high number of receptors for the hormone on its surface. Then here comes your hormone, and hormones diffuse around in your body fluids. Well, diffusion is somewhat random. You know, the hormone and its receptor have to come together. They have to bump into each other. So guess what? If this cell over here has more copies of the receptor on its surface, it's more likely that that hormone and the receptor are going to bump into each other. So that just kind of makes sense. The more receptors a target cell makes, the more likely it is that the hormone's going to attach, and then you're going to have the response to that hormone. Another concept is affinity. And the affinity between a receptor and hormone. Okay, so we said these are kind of like a lock and a key type scenario, but not all keys are as strongly attracted to locks as others. Affinity refers to how strongly attracted are a hormone and its receptor to each other. Do they have to be this close to come together, or can they be this far apart and still wind up coming together? So in this case, that hormone and its receptor would have a stronger affinity, because if they can still be farther apart from each other and still feel that magnetic pull drawing them together, they're going to have a higher affinity for each other than if a hormone and a receptor have to be really, really super close together before they're going to attach. So it makes sense, if a hormone and a receptor have a stronger affinity, then it's more likely they're going to come together, and therefore it's more likely that the target cells are going to respond to that hormone. So that's another thing that can determine how easy it is for a target cell to become activated or respond to a particular hormone. All right, our fourth lecture on this sort of introductory material about hormones and how they work will be on the control of hormone levels in the body. And then after that lecture, we'll start talking about particular hormones. We're going to move on and begin our discussions on the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland.